this is just the beginning.
Welcome to our Energy Forward, Reinventing the Grid virtual event. I'm Ben Geman, energy reporter at Axios, and I'm coming to you from Arlington, Virginia. Thank you to GE for making this conversation on energy resilience and the electric grid possible. And welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Please join the conversation today at Twitter with @Axios and #Axios events. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by my colleague, Andrew Freedman, and we'll spotlight conversations across the public and private sectors as they address reinventing the grid and how to drive sustainable energy transition while meeting our energy needs. Our first guest is the Senator from New Mexico, Martin Heinrich, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Senator.
Hi, glad to be with you today.
Thanks so much for being with us. Senator, you've introduced or co-sponsored several bills that are aimed at making U.S. power grids certainly more reliable, but also cleaner at the same time. So I wanted to ask, what are your biggest priority measures as these infrastructure talks intensify on Capitol Hill?
I think the biggest priority right now is trying to secure an investment tax credit for infrastructure, transmission lines in particular. You know, one of the things we've learned, and I've got well over a decade of experience with this now, is that these are such long lead time projects and such large price tag projects that any incentive and certainty that you can put into the process really does help with the final outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And, one of the things that was occurring to me is this week, we're unfortunately seeing this very high heat in the West that will strain power grids. And of course, tragically, we saw these winter grid failures in Texas. And I suppose in sort of, raw political terms, does that provide any type of opening for the type of legislation that you're seeking?
It does, in the sense that most people just expect the grid to work. You flip the switch and the light comes on. You turn the thermostat and your air conditioner is supposed to kick on. And I think people learned in both Texas with their extensive outages and in California that it's more complicated than that. And we really do need to reinvest in our grid. It needs to be much more robust because we're going to actually have a lot more electricity on the grid 10 years from now than we do now. And so it opens a door to that conversation that isn't naturally there. And I think we should use that as an opportunity to make the case that this is really important to people's lives.
And are you sensing that lawmakers in both parties want to sort of use that opportunity and recognize that increased salience of the topic? Because, of course, one of the big discussions right now is whether an infrastructure effort would be bipartisan or sort of move toward a reconciliation process that would be most likely Democrats only.
You know, what I can't say, I do think transmission generally is a bipartisan issue. There is a recognition on both sides that we need more transmission. I think when you get into the weeds of the best way to incentivize that, there may be some differences. But I don't think this is going to be one of those hot button issues that falls out because we fail to have agreement that this should be something that we prioritize.
Definitely. I think, along these same lines, I think a lot of people took notice recently when you said on Twitter, and I'll just quote from it directly, you said, quote, "An infrastructure package that goes light on climate and clean energy should not count on every Democratic vote," end quote. Senator, what does light mean? What do you need to see specifically to get your vote in an infrastructure package?
Well, some of the things that I'm looking for, obviously the clean energy standard is a really important principle if we're going to drive down carbon emissions overall in the country. Investments in both transmission and in electrification broadly. And by electrification, I mean that whether we're talking about transportation or we're talking about people's homes and businesses, so much of how we decarbonize is going to come down to no longer burning fossil gas in our homes and businesses and swapping those machines out that burn that fossil gas with electrically driven machines, things like heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. You know, that's all technology we have now. It's cheaper than the alternative, but there's a lot of upfront friction to those things. And so investments in that kind of infrastructure that is literally the infrastructure of your home, the infrastructure of your life, would be an important principle as well.
How do you remove that upfront friction that you mentioned? How do you how do you remove that? We often hear the term electrify everything for precisely the types of home appliances that you're talking about. What are the best ways, both the best ways and perhaps the most politically viable ways to remove that upfront friction that you just mentioned?
I think point of sale rebates are something we really need to lean in on. I mean, historically, we've used tax credits to incentivize many of these things. And when I look at the homes that need to be electrified in New Mexico, a lot of those constituents of mine don't have the tax liability to necessarily be able to use the tax credit effectively. So shifting from that mindset to point of sale rebates is, I think, a really important way of how we get at this, and do it broadly across the economy. Make sure that average and even low income people can make these changes, whereas tax credits tend to incentivize the top of the market.
And is that because the people who you would want to see installing this type of and choosing to install this type of equipment, as you mentioned, don't have necessarily the tax liability that would make those types of credits attractive or interesting to you?
That's exactly right. And we need to create incentives as well for the kind of investments in sort of home infrastructure. If you have a service panel and your house was built in 1950, chances are that service panel is not going to be big enough to handle the quantity of electricity if you start adding, additional an induction stove, a hot water heater that's 240 air source heat pump, even an electric vehicle, all of those sorts of things. We need to make sure that we have incentives to upgrade those service panels. And then it's quite easy to start adding many of these electrified machines.
Definitely. And, among the senators that share your view, both on these topics specifically around electrification, but, perhaps more broadly on the need to have, on your interest in having robust climate-related investments in an infrastructure package, is there a sort of group effort to push leadership and fence-sitting senators on this, or is it sort of more of an ad hoc thing at this point?
Well, I think what matters in this body is genuine relationships and genuine conversations. And so while all of the senators who really care about this are talking to each other, we're also talking to our colleagues, talking to the White House, talking to leadership, and talking to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and trying to find those places where we can build enough common ground to move forward.
And of course, one of those colleagues is someone whose name comes up a lot and is your colleague on the Energy Committee. The chairman of the committee is Senator Joe Manchin. And there's been a lot of speculation about whether, when push comes to shove, he might be willing to support a reconciliation bill, of course, legislation that would only require 51 votes instead of what's become the norm of 60 to move forward. Have you gotten a sense from him either way about whether that would be a possibility?
Well, first off, I try never to speak for my colleagues. I think that's very dangerous territory. But if you look at the state of West Virginia that he represents, it's a state that is full of what I often refer to as energy veterans, people who've kept the lights on for the rest of us for decades and decades. And when you have a transition that is as big and as deep as this one, and your primary, the coal jobs that really drove much of that economy historically have dwindled, well, there's huge opportunity in a reconciliation package. There are opportunities to create new energy industries and things like hydrogen, to really reinvest in ways that attract new industry to his state. So my hope is that he will see the opportunity to build a more prosperous West Virginia. That's certainly the way I come at this process. I know we need to solve the global problem of climate change, but I'm also looking for how to solve it for my constituents.
One of the policies that you mentioned a few moments ago, Senator, that sort of sits at the nexus of a lot of these ideas is this concept of a clean energy standard. How sort of alive, or how robust is the effort to sort of have a clean energy standard in a reconciliation package? I think, the White House domestic climate advisor, Gina McCarthy, recently attracted a lot of interest when she perhaps suggested in an interview that that might be something that would have to be left on the cutting room floor at the end of the day. I can't speak for her, of course, but that seemed to be at least the implication, perhaps, of some of her comments.
I can tell you that there was a huge reaction to the way those comments were at least interpreted, and that very quickly the White House walked those comments back. And I think that is indicative of just how much interest there is in a clean energy standard in our caucus. I think the question is, can you get it through reconciliation? And if it is structured to conform to the rules of reconciliation, I think the answer is yes.
And you think it can be constructed with the scaffolding around it in such a way that it would survive that process?
I do.
Senator, I think we're going to make that the last word. We're just about out of time. Thank you so much for joining Axios today.
No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And next we have a view from the top segment with my colleague, Vice President of Communications at Axios, Yolanda Brignoni.
Thanks, Ben. Now joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at GE Digital, Colin Paris. Hi, Colin.
Hi, Yolanda. Pleasure to be here with you.
We're happy to have you here. Let's dive into this conversation. Energy and climate change always receive the headlines and get unprecedented attention, especially in the most recent years. But unless there is a crisis, like there was in Texas, the grid is often an afterthought. Why do you think that needs to change?
That's a great question, Yolanda. Well, let me first start by explaining the grid. At a very high level, the grid is about two things, right? It's all about connectivity and continuity. Connectivity is connecting generation to consumption, from a power plant to our homes, our businesses. Continuity is all about ensuring that you have a constant flow of electrons so that when you turn that switch on, you get power. And if you have both of them, we call that a stable grid, right? And so what we've always tried to do over the last 100 years is keep that grid stable. What's different now is that grid actually is adding a few things that make it very dynamic. We're adding generation sources like renewables and wind that are always dynamic, right? Because the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. On the consumption side, we've put solar panels on our roofs. We have electric cars that are battery operated. Again, those are dynamic. So how do you add a lot of these connections as well as dynamic connections to the grid? We've got to find a way to make that stable again. At GE, we've spent a lot of time around this. In the last 100 years, right now, if you look at us, we generate more than 30% of the world's electricity. 90% of the top utilities have our transmission capabilities in them, and 40% of the world's electricity moves through our software. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about how we look at this problem and modernize the grid.
And speaking of cyber issues, we've had a recent spate of cyber attacks, and even the Secretary of Energy said the grid itself could be impacted by this in the future. Why do you think that we should be really focusing on this now and focusing on safeguarding the grid now for potential cyber attacks?
I think we have to focus on it right now, right, for potential and future cyber attacks. Now, the question is, how do you actually think about safeguards? And in order to think about safeguards, you've got to think about the characteristics of the threat you look at, right? So one aspect of the grid is that the grid is a shared ecosystem. It is the biggest system on the planet. It's connecting everything. So because it's a shared ecosystem, you have to have shared responsibility. So now you've got to bring together the people who create the equipment on the grid, people who build software for the grid, government agencies who write the policies, investors who invest in the markets that make the grid, and communities. Bring it together as a shared ecosystem to solve this cyber problem. Great example is something we call the GridWise Alliance. GE is a member of it. That's a body that has come together to look at the really hard problems on the grid, including cyber. And they're looking both at what are the actual problems that need to be solved by whom, what are the policies, and then actually what actually has to be done. That's one aspect. The other aspect of a cyber threat is that it's cyber, it's digital. So now you've got to look for digital solutions to solve that. So one great example of that is that we've been working, GE, with the Department of Energy for the past 3 years, and we've created something called Digital Ghost. We use our design, operational understanding together with data and AI, and that comes together in such a way that we can build a digital twin solution that can detect a cyber threat, isolate the threat, and then mitigate it. So those two things come together, the shared ecosystem and the digital aspect. And that's the way that you build a foundation for safeguarding it.
Wonderful. And you talked about this a little bit earlier, but can you talk about exactly what grid modernization really means today?
Yeah, excellent question. So let me give you an analogy that may make sense. So think about initially the grid as a one-way, one-lane street that goes from generation to consumption. Now, what you're trying to convert it to, because of all these new renewable sources to get clean energy and all of the solar panels you have, is it goes from a one-way, one direction, one road, one lane street, all the way to a multi-lane highway. Traffic is flowing in both directions. Current is flowing in both directions. You have multiple lanes, and you're creating a number of new off-ramps all the time where you're adding new renewables. So think about that, one lane road, multi-lane highway. What do you need to do with that? You need to do two things. One, there's a physical aspect of it. We need new lines that can attach these renewable sources that could be as far as the ocean, because you may have offshore wind. So you need these long transmission lines coming in, high voltage DC lines. Second, you need ways to use that hardware to avoid, things like congestion or to smooth out that traffic. Because again, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. That's the physical side. On the digital side, you need capabilities using that data and AI capabilities to forecast the problems you would have and what the impacts would be. And then you need real-time capabilities in order to actually control the flow of electrons right away once we know what the problems are. So it's a lot of new physical things and digital things that come together in this word modernization.
Wonderful. And it sounds like the Biden administration, they announced recently that some new financial tools to kind of help support the grid modernization. And it seems like we're kind of in that direction of gearing up that infrastructure. Can you say what else is really needed?
Yeah, well, first I applaud the work that's being done, right? I think it's great that we're focused on this huge energy challenge that we have. Now, if you ask me to add a few things, I'd say three things that I think we should be really focused on. One is we'll come back to this whole notion of the physical aspects of it, right? Again, what you're trying to do is you're adding more capability, so more lanes on that superhighway, right? And you do that by these extremely large high voltage DC connections that can move, electricity a long distance. Secondly, you've got to think about ways by which we manage the congestion that's going to come in and you smooth the traffic out. So physically, investing in those type of capabilities will help us significantly. Digitally, I go back to the old things. You've got to be able to predict what's going to happen. We can't be hit by unexpected storms or cyber attacks. So predict what's going to happen, predict how you would actually manage the impact. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to figure out how to do real-time capabilities so that we can actually look and figure out how to develop the control needed to get things done. Finally, research. Continue investing in things like grid forming, in R&D around AI, digital twins. Those are the three things I think would make a ton of sense for us now.
And so we've talked about a lot today, but to wrap up, what is the one big thing that you think could make the biggest difference in the grid?
In all honesty, it's you. It is you, meaning you and I, right? Right now, we are going from energy consumers to energy prosumers. We produce and we consume. We're going to be adding capability to the grid. So how do we integrate well with the grid, show our data on the grid so that we work harmoniously with the grid to get that done? That's the best thing.
Wonderful. Well, I thank you so much for this conversation, and thank you so much for joining Axios, Colin.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you again, Yolanda.
And thank GE for sponsoring. And now to my colleague, Andrew Freedman.
Thanks very much, Yolanda. I'm Andrew Freedman. I'm the energy and climate reporter for Axios. Our final guests are President and CEO of the New York Power Authority and Chair of GridWise Alliance, Gil Quiniones, joining us from New York, and CEO of GridWise Alliance, Karen Wayland, joining us from Lebanon, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us. Hello, Gil and Karen.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Let's get right into it in terms of how the New York Power Authority is working to transition to be more resilient and smarter in terms of how you want your grid to evolve and incorporating new technology in doing that. That's to Gil, obviously.
Yeah, well, again, thank you for having me. The New York Power Authority is the largest state-owned electric utility in the U.S., and we produce about 25% of electricity in New York, 80% of that from hydroelectric power. So we are really the foundation for renewable energy in the state of New York. We have very aggressive goals here in New York, nation-leading goals, 70% renewable by 2030 and carbon-free electricity by 2040. And our hydro is the foundation of that. And we have been investing in our hydro power plants. Our last investment, our flagship power plant, the Niagara Power Project, we're investing $1.2 billion over the next 12 years. NYPA also owns a third of the transmission system here in New York. And we are building new transmission, applying new technology to integrate renewables onto the grid. Right now, there are 5 major electric transmission projects being built in upstate New York. NYPA, the New York Power Authority, we are building 3 of them. To give you a context, the last major transmission line built in upstate New York was in the late 70s and early 80s. So a lot of build out is happening here. We're applying smart grid technologies like series compensation and other flexible alternating current technologies, again, to make the grid more resilient, more flexible, and to integrate renewables into our power system. We are also working with our customers to help decarbonize their operations, energy efficiency, solar, storage, and the nation's largest fast charger networks along highways that is being built by NYPA.
And tell me, Karen, regarding the work that your organization is doing that Gil's also involved in, how you're advocating for strengthening energy resilience and enabling cities and states to rebuild infrastructure in a smarter, more resilient way. I lived for quite some time in New York City through many different storm events there, and saw, some of the grid challenges in New York, Connecticut, the tri-state area. Seemed to be a hotspot for constant storms of different types. And I know there's a lot of need up there, as well as in other parts of the country. So I'm really curious as to what you're seeing and what work you're doing.
Well, since last summer, we have been developing a set of recommendations if Congress actually works on an infrastructure package, which they are doing right now. And we looked at a bucket of 7 different funding streams at Department of Energy and at other agencies as well to make federal investments to support the investments that are being made by utilities and by states and local governments in both the grid itself and resilient infrastructure around the grid in the case of any power disruptions. So Gil mentioned flexibility. We are recommending a significant sum of funding for increasing the flexibility of the grid, which actually helps to increase resilience as well. So things like sensors, advanced grid controls, data analytics, software service storage. These are technologies that help the grid respond faster and more accurately to signals coming across from distributed energy resources or utility scale resources. But they also help the grid respond to potential disruptions from extreme weather and from and from wildfire and other things. We are recommending investments in cybersecurity, which absolutely builds out the resilience of the system and is really critical. We know that energy equipment has long been vulnerable, but we just had the Colonial Pipeline. You couldn't have a more visible evidence of the importance of energy infrastructure and the quite big disruptions if a cyber attack is able to get through protections. So there's a whole suite of things that we're recommending that both will increase the ability of the grid to be a platform for decarbonization, but also build out resilience.
And Gail, when it comes to resilience, New York State deals with everything from blizzards to hurricanes to cyber threats and many other challenges. How do you manage that and the priorities of modernizing the smart grid so that you have more ability to bring in more variable, renewable resources, which may be coming in different parts of the state? When you're building out a smarter grid, I want to get down to the level of the person on the street as to how they can understand what a smart grid actually is, because they just see power lines and places connected to them, but I don't know that they understand how it operates.
Absolutely. And as you know, for example, New York City, because it's the financial capital and media capital of the world, the reliability and resiliency of the grid is very important. And so what we're doing is from hardening the grid, which is one part. After Superstorm Sandy, we had to elevate substations. These are the equipment that switch electricity and power flows. We had to design submersible transformers because we're very close to the river and the Atlantic Ocean. So those are the hardening part. In terms of overhead lines, we're building stronger lines and stronger poles and arms so that they don't go down as quickly. But while we're doing that, as Karen said, in today's age, we can add sensors and digital technology to those equipment so that we can monitor the health of those assets all the time. And we can respond to whatever is needed, both from a controls perspective or from deployment of people and workers to address issues. That's what it means when we say we're investing in the grid. It's really, it happens both resiliency and smart grid or automation and flexibility. They all happen at the same time.
Great. And Karen, you're somebody who has worked at various levels of government, both for the legendary Harry Reid in the Senate, as well as in senior levels of the Energy Department. So you've seen how legislation is both made and what goals might look like from the top down. From your position now, with interests in modernizing the grid and increasing clean energy, what aspects of the Biden infrastructure plan, particularly, excite you? Are you particularly enthusiastic about, either as a person or as an organization? And do you hope to get through and make through in some way or another?
Well, I think it was quite smart of the president to have his climate policy revolve around investments in infrastructure, because once that money goes out into the economy, it's durable policy. We build equipment, we deploy technologies, and those will help address climate goals. And once that money goes out into the economy, it's not something that can be rolled back. So I thought that using infrastructure as climate policy was very smart. There's a lot in there for the grid. There are investments. There are recommended investments in electrification of transportation and electrification of buildings, energy efficiency for buildings, the federal fleet electrification, electrifying school buses. There is a focus on transmission, both in terms of creating an investment tax credit, but also in helping to accelerate some of the approval process by creating a grid development authority at the Department of Energy. So there's a lot in there that we like. What we hope to see in the final package is at least $50 billion for investments in the grid, because as we electrify transportation, as we electrify buildings, as we move to decarbonize the economy, the grid has to be able to accommodate all of that new load, and a lot of it is mobile sources, the cars moving around the country, and you've got to make sure that where the load needs to be, where the power needs to be for charging stations, and also to have a much more flexible grid that can respond to varying loads that we currently don't have plugged into the grid right now. So we believe that as you're making investments in decarbonization, you also have to make parallel investments in the grid to make sure that grid can be the platform for what you're trying to do.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you for this discussion. This was actually really, really quite interesting.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks again, Gil and Karen, for joining us at Axios. And thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. Thank you to our sponsor, GE, for making this event possible. We hope to see you again next month for our next Energy Forward event on the future of alternative energy. To sign up for Ben's newsletter and a newsletter I contribute to you, Axios Generate, or learn more about climate tech from our latest Get Smart series, visit Axios.com or on the Axios app. Thanks all for joining, and we'll see you on Axios.com.